This is the Martial Arts Lifestyle Podcast, where we have conversations with everyday martial artists about their histories and how martial arts influence their daily lives. You are listening to the abbreviated version of this podcast, which is the first 20 minutes or so of the show. Please consider supporting the show by subscribing on our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/MALMAG, and for about the price of one coffee shop coffee per month, you can get access to 4 new podcasts each month, 1 week before their YouTube release dates. You also have access to all of our existing shows, which at this point is about 100 hours of shows for you to enjoy. Individual shows can be purchased at our Gumroad page. That is malmag.gumroad.com. This week I get on Zoom and I connect to the Bay Area in California and talk to one of my oldest friends in the Filipino martial arts, Jason Inay. We talk about what it was like for him to be born and raised in a legendary Escrima family, his professional endeavors, his cross-training, and we get a great lesson on Stockton history. Sit back and enjoy. Welcome to the Martial Arts Lifestyle Podcast, and today I'm connecting to, I wouldn't say necessarily Northern California, but north from me, maybe more Central California, but this is one of my oldest friends in the martial art world, and I know he's got an interesting story, so I've been just dying to get him on here, and happy that I have. So I'm recently at an instructor conference, so welcome to Jason Inay to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, buddy. Well, you know, the usual starting questions, we always ask how people got involved in martial arts. And I mean, this is almost like a kind of a dumb question to ask you because you were literally born into it.
Yep. My dad started me, quote unquote, playing Escrima when I was a little kid. I mean, like, I don't have any memory because like it's very, very little, like 4 years old. There was at one time a bunch of Super 8 film. I don't know where that film is anymore. And that dates me right there. There's handheld.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Of me training.
I still have it?
I don't know where it is, but there's a picture on my Facebook profile that I use every once in a while. And it's me like swinging a stick and my dad's holding my little sister and Angel's Cabal's Grandmaster Angel Cabal is watching. Right. And I'm like, I can't be more than 3 or 4 years old in that picture.
Well, that's really cool. Well, I'm just saying, if you ever find it, I'm literally looking across the room. I've got an 8mm projector here, so I can transfer that for you. If you ever find it, you know, you can get it digital. And I know this thing works. I haven't turned it on in a while, but I do know that it works. So, you know, if you find it, give me a holler. I'd be happy to transfer that for you.
Certainly. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So, you grew up then in Stockton, I guess, yeah?
Oh, my family's from Stockton, right? So my mother's side of the family was in Stockton proper, really, I would say. And then my father, he's from more out in the boonies, out like where the dikes are and everything, right? So
okay,
he grew up in Hood, California, and he was born in Dos Palos, California. Right. Oh, wow. So, you know, lots of family trips into Stockton all the time, mostly for the family, but it dovetailed into my father taking private lessons from Grandmaster Angel Cabales, Grandmaster Leo Giron, and of course, Grandmaster Max Hermanta.
Wow. So is your family first gen, or is it their parents that are from the Philippines, or were they from? Or?
So my father's father is first gen, right? Like he came to California by way of Hawaii, like when he was like between 14 and 16 years of age.
Wow.
Worked the farms that whole time, working the fields. My mother's side of the family, I think my grandfather came from the Philippines, but I'm pretty sure my grandmother was born here, right? So it depends on which side. I'm either second or third generation, depending on which side you look at, right?
Cool. Well, that's really interesting. I mean, it's cool because, you know, I hear, and as do you, all the stories of this community, obviously from Guru Dam, but you actually kind of lived it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I grew up all that time. My grandparents were Leonardo de Trabajo members, right? Which is, the Bahalana, the Huron Arnis lineage. They're very closely tied to that organization, which is essentially a Masonic organization
Oh wow, didn't
for
know that.
Filipinos. Yeah, I mean, they have the same traditions and great, well, not the same, similar, right? And some people will say that it harkens back to the Katipuneros, of the Spanish American, Spanish American Filipino American wars and stuff like that, and the liberation of the Filipinos from Spanish rule, and then uh, striving for their own identity out of the American protectorate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a interesting history, especially considering I think as Guru Dan talks about, people don't really understand how many different groups the Philippines are. So you've got a united identity that probably came mostly from World War II and partially probably from the Spanish American War, but then you've got all these individual groups as well. I mean, the last time I looked at it, was like 112 languages or 116 languages spoken there, and then there was like 138 total, but the 112 of them are still actually spoken.
That's dependent upon, I mean, if you're talking about actual tongues, right? So
Right.
there's this political derivation or designation of Tagalog being the language, and then all the other major languages are dialects, but that's a political designation. If you're talking
Yeah.
to linguists, they're actually very different tongues,
Yeah.
right? The unifying linguistic element would be the Spanish. My grandfather spoke fluent English, Spanish, Tagalog, and Ilocano. My grandmother spoke fluent English, Ilonggo, Visayan, and Tagalog in English,
Wow.
right? So and I imagine my grandfather Salvador, he did the same, right? But I didn't know him as long because he died when I was a teenager. So
Wow. So how are you like linguistically? Are you multilingual?
yes, but not that much of the mother tongue, right? Like I can understand a little bit of Tagalog, and I can understand a little bit of Ilocano. The sad thing that we don't talk about historically speaking when it comes to the movement of Filipino martial arts in the United States is its ethnic identity kind of genesis, that what precipitates it, right? So uh, um, my father was part of the West Coast Escrima Society, right? One of the founding members, right? And they did good things. They tried to do foolish things. But ultimately they were striving for an identity for the Filipino and the Filipino American in the United States. And it stems from things like, if you're Ilocano, you don't get acceptance from the Visayans and the Tagalogs in the work camps. If you're Tagalog, vice versa, right? Like there's this infighting. You mentioned the unification of the people when there's a common enemy, but then they are reduced to the tribalism at that point, right? Which is a separation of not only region but language, right? As we've spoken about, but also a separation cuisine to a degree. And then, of course, the pride of the fighting Filipino, right? All of those things kind of separate them. My father grew up in the work camps, and he would try to learn. So he'd be at one fire and he'd be like trying to learn, and they're teaching him Visayan, and he'd go to the Tagalogs and he'd say something and they would call him an idiot because he didn't speak Tagalog. He was speaking Visayan to them, right? So that coupled with during that time, you're talking about the late 1930s, into the 1950s, the California Educational Administration and who the powers that be were encouraging the Filipino families to not teach the children the language because it would be harder for them to assimilate in English speaking American schools. And
Right.
the segregation that is so, popularized, it's just disseminated. So we're all well informed of the segregation of the African American and the American, or the white American, right? It's
Right.
very, very frequently under reported how much segregation there was for Filipinos in California. When you say Central California, that usually means Stockton, Sacramento, that area. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, right? That Central California area. I mean, you go to a water fountain and say Filipinos only on this side, no Filipinos on the other side. You go to a any kind of business and say no Filipinos beyond this point, and it's a sign right on the door, right? There's this sentiment when my father was growing up, where you're a second class citizen, and even him more so because he was mestizo, he wasn't full-blooded Filipino, right? So there's this loss of identity. You lose your language. I mean, there's three major things that you look for an advanced culture, right? Written language, which the Spanish destroyed during colonization for the most part, and only through the effort of my uncle Dan, Guru Dan, and my father did Baybayin and Alibata become prevalently used in Filipino martial arts. Prior to that, most Filipinos had never seen Alibata. They'd never seen it, or what we call Baybayin. They never seen it before, right? Because the Catholic dominated culture, that script was so close to Sanskrit that it was not favored, to put it nicely, right?
Right. Yeah.
So written
considered
language is gone. The ability to work metal, which the Filipinos have, right? And sauces in your foods. Well, we're not practicing metallurgy in the United States. And of course we're eating the food, and the food has sauces. It's not just burnt meat over a fire, right?
Right.
But then there's the language. There's the erosion of not only the written language, but even the spoken language in a whole generation of Filipino Americans coming out of California, right? So there's this need for some kind of ethnic pride. So Max Sarmento, great Grandmaster Max Sarmento, as I refer to him now, right, was this community leader. He was a labor leader. He spoke very good English with almost no accent. He was a U.S. military veteran, and he was a community leader among the Filipinos. And so he brings out Manong Angel as the person that he supported to teach Filipino martial arts to the public in Stockton, California area. And it wasn't because he was the best. There were other people repeatedly that were actually better. If you have a chance to talk to, like, my uncle Al Concepcion, who was one of Manong Angel's top students and a senior to pretty much everybody that we talk about today, senior, at least under Manong Angel, senior to Dan, my uncle Dan, senior to my father, senior to, well, I think the only other person that was senior would have been Dentoy Revelar, right? When you talk to those guys, and a lot of them are gone now, but they were, the reason why Manong Angel was picked wasn't because he was the best fighter in the work camps or that he had all those death matches. It was because he could speak English well enough for people to understand, and he had a structure to his teaching that wasn't like, all right, we're going to do this drill and we call it this one, and then we have the other one over there, and when he does this one, we do that one. And he had language to describe things, nothing close to the way that the Chinese martial arts has a word for everything and a name for everything, right, but much better than the Manong, oh, you'll do that one, I do this one now, you see, right? It was a little bit more structured, and it became more structured over time because of one of his students, my father, right? And so that was mostly just to give identity in the beginning to the Filipinos. That wasn't just like, okay, you're only good enough to be a farm worker. Uncle Dan always talks about you could be working in the fields next to someone who has a degree in political science, and another one that's a biologist, and another one that has advanced degree in English literature. But because they were Filipino, the best work that they could get was box or work in the farms.
Right.
So that was a big part of the genesis of the Filipino martial arts, in the United States. Arguably not the first public school, but definitely the most popular school. And it's because of not Filipino martial arts. It's because of 4 people. We go, like, obviously Guru Dan, right? Obviously Guru Dan's close relationship with Sigmund Bruce, right? But more so his relationship with Grandmaster Ed Parker, right? That got Filipino martial arts to be displayed at the Karate Internationals, or whatever it's called, right? And in the same sense, up here in the north, in the Bay Area, Ernie Reyes did the same thing here.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. And so, and that's the genesis of the West Coast Escrima Society, is those two things happening in close time to each other, talking about between the 60s and 70s, right? And so now you can't go to, at least here in the Bay Area, you cannot go to a window school without them doing Escrima in most cases, unless
Really?
they're an ATA school or they're a WTF school or something like that, right? The World Taekwondo Federation, right? So because of Ernie Reyes's West Coast martial arts and the thing that they do, like all of them have to learn fundamental Sinawali, fundamental reinforced blocking, which we call the Curtis in the Inayan System of Escrima, and then other martial arts. Since then, Ernie Reyes Jr., who eventually became a movie star, right, and he was in like movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and all these other things. He's a Sayat Kali guy now.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
he trains in Sayat Kali. Like, he's since grown away from the Stockton FMA, and he's a big, I don't know if I'd say big proponent, but he's a proponent of Sayat, right? That's what he does.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? So, there's all of the proliferation, by and large, due to Rene Latosa, who's the first person to bring FMA to Europe, right? My father, who was one of the pivotal figures in the West Coast Escrima Society, and Guru Dan, right? And even more so, Guru Dan, because of his close relationship with Sigung Bruce Lee, which opened a lot of doors and allowed him to do that. And then, of course, his familial relationships coming from Stockton. And, my family and his family are very closely tied, right? And that opens doors to learning from Manong Lacoste, learning from Manong Angel, and from Manong Lino, and from Manong Gilbertino, and all these other people.
Yeah, that all-star list that you said there, and it's great story you just told there with a lot of information, and kind of brings a lot of questions from me, which you're stimulating my brain, which is good, especially with a question I keep forgetting to ask, and I think you probably is qualified to answer this as anybody. So I've always been curious about that Babayan script. Is that a written version of which of the Filipino languages?
Yes. There are actually several different alphabets. There's a Tagalog one, there's an Ilocano one, there's a Visayas. They're slightly different.
Got it. Okay. Yeah,
right?
I was
and
curious.
There's been a lot of modernization in terms of trying to accommodate the letter C as an example, right? Because the letter C does not exist until the Spanish come.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, there's, and also probably, this is a conjecture because I haven't done a lot of research beyond the use of it today. It probably depends a lot on how they wrote it, right? A lot of the, partially, I understand from my research, they got rid of the writing because it was too closely resembled Sanskrit, which was associated with Islam. And
right.
The word of Islam, the word of Muhammad, reached the Philippines 1,000 years before the word of Christ, right? So, but they're a seafaring. What was that?
The basic greeting, or the basic thank you, is a derivative of the Arabic anyway.
Yeah, salamat.
Yeah, salamat. Yeah, exactly.
Salam, right? It is. Right? So you look at that, and then you look at the idea that, okay, this is a maritime society. These are people that live in an archipelago. So any written communication of any kind, there's probably mostly trade documents as much as anything else, in treaties, right, things like that, are written on something that will survive being wet all the time.
Correct. Yeah.
So not paper, not skin, and not wood. That leaves you with copper plates.
Yeah.
That leaves you with maybe scratched on shell, maybe scratched on stone, but most of the historical representations that were able to be recovered were on copper plates, right? Wow. So this is smelted copper that's been beat and flattened and then scratched, with, or inscribed with the script, right? Which also gives credence to the reason why they use curved letters as opposed to angular letters and things.
Yeah, like that, right? To put into the
yeah. So, and the Philippines was the first colony of the Spanish, not the second. The first colony in terms of stature, right? A favor would be the Mexican colonies, the New Spain colonies, because they have gold. All they got from the Philippines is mostly slaves, but those conquistadors, the militant monks, were trying to compete with the Spanish in terms of influence, right? So they melt down all that copper. Right. That's from my meager research is shown is that's likely what was happening, right? And I've seen some writings from the historical annals that were, like, this is the language of the devil or something to that effect, and so that were eradicated and that stuff too, right? So
but and that makes sense to a point, but I think also just what you're saying, a grab of a resource and just simply control makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I mean, what people forget about the conquistadors, right, is, sure, some of them were devout monks that were given a writ from the papacy to be on conquest, and a conquistador is just a word for knight. So they're the conquistadors of the Order of St. James or Santiago that went to the Philippines are on par with the Knights Templar and on par with the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights, but they're the Spanish Knights, right?
Right.
And so they go out there to bring out the word of God, but it's funded by the crown, and all of the noblemen are the captains of industry, if you will, right? These are conquistadors. The Germans called those people Habsbrüders, right? They were usually unlanded nobles of second and third in line and would not basically be able to inherit title. So they would go out and they would go to off lands to conquer them, to establish their own land and to establish their own taxes and their own aristocracy. Right? And that's just the way that the church at the time worked. I used to have a very severe look at that, but now I just look at that as that was the sign of the times, right? I wouldn't be who I am without that have happened. And were there tragic, atrocious things happening? 100%. But at the same time, I can't be mad about that, right? It doesn't serve.
Yeah, I mean, well, we can be mad about it, but it doesn't do any good. But we can acknowledge, hey, it's maybe not the best way of going about things in our modern sense, but there
was definitely a loss of cultural identity to a degree, but a new culture came up after 350 years of influence,
right?
And that brought out beautiful things as well.
Exactly. So another thing with what you were talking about earlier that I found really interesting, and Guru's pointed this out too, was when you're talking about why, like, Anglo Cabalist got the position he did, is why do you think a lot of the Filipino martial arts and instructors of which, or masters of which, kind of had that sort of loosey-goosey, for lack of better terms, way of teaching it or putting it forward? Is that a cultural thing, or do you think there was a
lot of things, right? So you have, Uncle Dan's always talking about there's like with the 7 influences to the Majapan Empire and into then the Filipino, right? You have, and specifically speaking about Philippines, right? You're talking about Northern European influence through English and the United States, which by extension is German, right?
Right.
And then you have Southern influence by the Spanish, which would also include Italians and maybe even French or Boscaneros and things like that. And the reality of that too also is that while that those ships were funded by the Spanish.
And this concludes the abbreviated version of the podcast. Please consider supporting the program by going to www.patreon.com/MALMAG and subscribing to the show. You can also purchase this individual episode or any individual episode at our Gumroad page. That's malmag.gumroad.com. Thank you for listening to this episode with Jason and I. Coming up next week, I speak with one of my oldest Inosanto Academy friends and instructors, Utah's Ray Rosales. Our Malmag online store at martialartslifestylemagazine.com has a full selection of Timmy B's brand sticks for FMA and Krabiker Bong. Timmy B's brand now selling in Japan as well. Beautiful Timmy B's brand shirts and Dos Manos shirts are available with new t-shirt designs and more products coming soon. An online course in the Dos Manos method for FMA is available under the Courses tab. More courses coming soon. Check out the Places to Train tab to find schools near you, and click on the Events Calendar page to see what seminars and events are happening all around the world. And of course, visit our main page for articles on the martial arts. Music by Jackal Relic. Martial Arts Lifestyle Magazine and the Martial Arts Lifestyle Podcast are trademarked and copyrighted by TNT LLC.